In this video, I'm going to show you how to graph on Desmos using domain or range restrictions. So if you want to graph piecewise functions on Desmos, this is how you do it. I'll also show you how to shade if you want to, and I'll show you how to change the color of the graphs and things like that. So I'm going to maybe just draw like almost like a sunset on a horizon. I'm not going to get into it like a lot, but it'll just be kind of an idea of how to shade and domains and things like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a horizontal line for my horizon. And so I'm just going to kind of, to put it sort of in the middle of the frame here, I'll just say y equals 4, and that'll be my line. But let's say I don't want my horizon to be quite as long as it is. Let's say that, because it's going from negative infinity to positive infinity right now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to chop off the domain, and I'm going to graph it from 2 to 6. So what you do is, after you graph your function, you use the kind of curly braces or curly brackets like that, and then you restrict the domain, which means you cut off the graph. And so I said I wanted to graph it between x equals 2 and x equals 6. So I would say 2 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 6. And what that does is, that tells me only to graph that line y equals 4 between 2 and 6. So let's say that I have that line right there, and my horizon is blue right now. Let's say I want to change that color. So what you do is you come over here to this little icon, and you hold down the left mouse key until that pops up, and it gives you some different options. So things that you could do is you can change the color right here, or you could even change what the line looks like. So if you want it to be dotted, well, this is more like dashed. This is dotted, so that's what dotted would look like. This is what dashed would look like. You can do things like that. You can also change the thickness of the line. So like, let's say you want that line to be thicker. I'll just put like a bigger number there, and that makes it like a pretty thick line. I'm actually not certain what this does, and I still sort of don't see what it's doing. So sorry about that. I'm just going to like default that to 1 because I really don't know what that does. I'd have to look it up. Okay, so let's say that I've graphed that horizon. Now let's say I want to graph a sunset. So to me, a sunset would look like a semicircle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to graph a circle, but I'm going to put it center right here. So that means that half of it will graph above the horizon and half of it will graph below. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the half that's below, because we wouldn't see it because it's below the horizon. So I'm going to graph a circle with a center of 4, 4. So that would be x minus 4 squared plus y minus 4 squared. And I'm not sure how big I want my circle to be, so I'll give it a radius of 1 and see what that looks like. So maybe I want that to be a little bit bigger, so let's see what a radius of 2 looks like. So that looks good to me. The sun would definitely not be green, so I'm going to change its color to orange by doing what I showed you earlier. And then the other thing I want to do is I want to delete this whole bottom part, okay? Now this is a little bit tricky because I can't do a domain restriction, because if I tell it just to graph between this point and this point, actually, you know what? I'm going to change my radius so that those go onto whole numbers. Otherwise, let me see. There, that'll work. No, we'll go back to that. Sorry. I just wanted my endpoints to be whole numbers here so that it wasn't confusing. If I say only graph this from 3 to 4, it's not going to change anything because this is only graphed from 3 to 4. So actually what I want is I want it to graph from 4 on the y-axis until 5 on the y-axis. Now, remember, I'm saying y-axis this time, so I want to chop this part off. So that's called a range restriction. So instead of saying graph it between these two x values, because that's not going to change anything, I want to tell it to graph it between the y value of 4 and the y value of 5. So I want it to graph from here up. So that's called a range restriction. So still the same curly brackets, but we would say start on the y-axis on 4 is less than or equal to, now you have to say y. and then is less than or equal to 5. Now that I didn't really have to finish that, but not to confuse you. So I ask it to graph between 4 and 5 on the y-axis so that it gave me the top half of the circle. Now the other thing you can do, the sun would be orange here as well. So if you wanted to shade in all these points below that arc, you just change your equal sign to a less than or equal to sign, because that means it will graph all of the points on the circumference plus all of the points that are in here. So we just say is less than or equal to, and now it shaded the sun. If you like those dots, you would just leave off the equal sign, and then it gives you more of a dashed look. If you don't like the dashes, then you would put the equal to sign back on, and then the arc part is solid. So that's up to you. I'm trying to think what else I can show you. You can do this domain restriction with like anything, right? So let's say maybe I want to graph like a bird in the sky, and let's say that I think that looks like a square root graph. So let's say I want to graph y equals the square root of x, and let's move him over to the right. So we would do like -1, and then let's move him up high in the sky. So let's do like +6. So he's there. Obviously, the bird doesn't have an infinite wing. So let's say I want to just make him go until 2. So that's 2 on the x-axis. So I would say, okay, graph him from 1 to 2. So I would say, bracket, curly bracket, 1 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 2. So that's the right-hand side of his wing. Now, if I want the left-hand side of his wing, what's cool is I know that I can just put a negative, but you have to think about where you have to put the negative. So if I put a negative on the outside of this graph, so I'm going to copy this because I want to do the same thing. I want to make my bird look symmetric. So if I do that again, now obviously this is, well, let's actually just leave it on for a second to show you. If I put a negative in front of here, that's going to flip it down. So obviously the bird doesn't look like that. I want to flip it to the left, so the negative goes on the inside. But then, this is the tricky part, I got to turn this domain part off because it won't graph it then because I have this restriction. Now, here's the thing. I also need to move him over. This negative in front makes things tricky. So what you actually want is the negative in parentheses, and then it'll do it. Okay, you just have to play around with this stuff. And now I can see like I've got way too much bird wing over here. So perhaps I want to stop him at 0. So I only want to graph him from 0 to, that's 1 on the x-axis. So I want to graph him from here to here. So I'm going to say left endpoint, 0 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 1. So then I've got a pretty good symmetric looking bird. And then I want him to be the same color. Let's make him black. So I'll just change this one to black. And then I've got my bird. Okay. So if you wanted to tilt that, there's things in Trig you can mess with. And I encourage you to do that. Like just, mess with stuff and see what it does. So that's sort of the idea of everything. If you know the domain restrictions and you know the range restrictions, that's the idea of it. You have to play around with graph transformations that you should have learned in Algebra 2. And so that's kind of how you do it. And like I said, you can see how to do the shading and things like that. And if you have any questions, just ask. Hope this helped.